Were you born here?
No, well, to start it off, see, my dad lived in Winnipeg. He was just a young fellow, and he was one of these fellows that wanted to go someplace, full of adventure, you know. And in those days, in '98, the Klondike and the Kootenays, they were both the big uh, places to go to. And he didn't know which to go, so he took a trip through here just after they finished building the Crow's Nest Pass line. And it would be about the latter part of 1898. He came in through Nelson and down to Sproats Landing here and up the Arrow Lakes to Revelstoke and back to Winnipeg. And this mountain country, oh, it appealed to him. But he got married after he got back there, and that stopped all the adventuring for a while. But being a prairie chicken, I was just a little over a year old, I imagine, when he decided to go homesteading in Alberta, and up at what they call Snake Lake. Nowadays it's called Sylvan Lake, but in those days it was Snake Lake. And he went there because he never was meant to be a farmer. He just didn't have that kind of characteristic. So, and he couldn't forget these mountains and the rivers and that. So in 1904, he came to Revelstoke. That was the jumping off place in those days for the Kootenays, was Revelstoke. So he came to Revelstoke and stayed there. And of course we lived there. I was 4 years old then. And but I can remember a lot of things about Revelstoke. It was a pretty wild town, I know that. And and I can still remember being only, 5 years old or something like that, when the steamer Revelstoke would come down from the mines up around the Big Bend country. And when they'd unload all these miners, and that town just used to vibrate for a few days. Even as a child, I could feel it. And we lived in Lower Town, of course, which was the old part of town, and the original part of Revelstoke. The Upper Town was just starting to be built up then, and the hotels down there were the main hotels. The Oriental Hotel and the Central Hotel, the Victoria Hotel, and then, of course, a fellow named Wells had a men's furnishing store. And, of course, being around there, the fellows there, the miners were around there, and there was a big red light district just near the bridge there. Some of the polite people used to call them hostess houses. But
You mean for the hostesses?
yes, and they had every nationality you can think around there. And even as kids, of course, all we knew about them, there were places we weren't supposed to go down there, but we knew there were Japanese women, Negro women, and every kind of women you could think about. And so the fellows, of course, were all around there, all these miners. And I can remember one fella, I think his name was Gillett, but his idea of being a big shot in those days was to light his cigars with dollar bills. And he'd take his dollar bill out and he'd get a match and light this bill, and then he'd light his cigar with it. And of course, we kids hanging around there waiting for him to throw it down so that we could grab it before it burnt too much, And he get lots of fun out of that, the kids scrambling for his dollar bills. But after 3-4 days, the boat was loaded, and the miners were all on board again, back up the river to the mines, and peace settled over the territory again till the next boat came down. About every 2 weeks, the boat used to come down. And
I suppose the railroad people were comparatively quiet.
well, oh yes, at that time the railroad, of course, the railroad was the big thing, but it was all in the Upper Town, you see, and the station was up above, and the railroad men, some of them lived down in Lower Town, some of them lived Upper Town, but there was no, the railroad boom was all over at that time, see, and it was really the mining and the lumbering. There was a sawmill across the lakes, and I remember my dad climbing that mountain behind Revelstoke, Mount Revelstoke there, where they have that park up there now. There's a little lake up there, and he and two other fellows, they climbed that mountain and were gone a weekend. They went up there, and I remember when he came home saying that that'll be a wonderful place up there for a park, if they could ever get a road up to it, because he says there's a beautiful lake up there, and there's trees and everything. Of course, he never did get over what a beautiful country this was. And even from a small child, I don't think there was a weekend we weren't out picnicking on Sunday afternoon. We'd always be out somewhere, you know.
What was your dad's name?
Leveque. It was the same as mine.
Eugene?
His name was Eugene Leveque. And
Did he actually come from Winnipeg, or did he come into Winnipeg?
no, he was born in Winnipeg. It's an old family there in Winnipeg. In fact, his mother was a cousin of Louis Riel's. You know, they were around that Red River country. Actually, he was born in St. Boniface, but he lived in Winnipeg across the river, and the family had been there for quite a long time.
Where did they come from originally? From Quebec or from?
Well, his dad came from Quebec. His mother was born on the Red River, although she had gone back to Quebec for a trip, and that's where she met his father. And they were married there, lived in Worcester, Massachusetts for a while, and finally came back to Winnipeg, to St. Boniface, rather, and lived there. And my mother, of course, she was born in Montreal, and her dad died when she was just a young girl, and she moved to New York with her mother and stayed there. In fact, when she moved to Winnipeg, she was a young lady then, and she lived in Winnipeg, and they were married there. And she was, but they had come from, my dad's folks had lived in Manitoba for 4 or 5 generations.
Did your mother come from that part too?
No, she was from Montreal.
Was she in Montreal? Yes.
Yeah, she was from Montreal, and the family. There's still some of her family down there, although I've lost all contact with them. But her name was Duquette. And there are the Duquette family in Montreal. There's quite a number of them around there yet. But I know at one time she had an uncle who was a member of Parliament, because I have a letter that her aunt wrote to her in Revelstoke in 1905 there on the House of Commons stationery that he wrote the letter on.
Did she like Winnipeg?
Did
she like Revelstoke?
Oh yes. My mother was just as taken with this country as my dad was. Yes, we lived there until 1908, and then we moved to Comaplix.
What was a Comaplix?
Well, Comaplix was a sawmill town, and if it wasn't the first sawmill in the Kootenays, it was one of the first, because they had a sawmill there in 1892, and it was. When we went there, it was owned by the Bowman Lumber Company of Portland, Oregon. And my dad had a very serious illness in Revelstoke, and he was told he could never work anymore. But things were pretty tough for some time. I don't know yet how our mother made it, because there was no unemployment or anything like that in those days, and he was in the hospital for 6 months.
You mean there was no unemployment benefits?
No unemployment benefits and that sort of thing, you know. And no free hospital, and everything they had just went for doctors and hospitals. But my mother kept us going somehow, and we went to Comaplix, and he got a job in the sawmill there as a trimmer, which was a fairly easy job because he could sit down and just had to pull levers, and saws would pop up out of a table and trim the lumber. And apparently, if you don't watch what you're doing, you can waste a great deal of lumber. And he had a knack for it, and he wasn't wasting any lumber, and he did so well that they raised his pay, and he finally saved up enough money, and we went back to Winnipeg rather for a trip. And they wired him after he got there to come back, and they offered him more money again. So he was very happy there in Comaplix, and it was a wonderful place to raise kids. When I think of I don't think anybody could have had a happier boyhood than a fella'd have in a place like Comaplix with the flats and the mountains around there that were full of raspberries. The fish were all over the creeks and in the lakes. We used to go down to the wharf and fish and fish in the creeks as kids, you know. And there was a little schoolhouse up in the hill with only about a dozen of us in the school, and we used to have a good place to play there. We had a little trouble one night. After school, we came out there, and there was quite a habit in those days with canned goods to make a cross, cut a cross in the top of the can and push in the four corners, you know, and empty the contents. Well, it left four corners in the can, and there was a skunk had got its head into this can and, of course, couldn't get it out because the corners were sticking into his neck. So the grounds around the schoolyard were pretty wild there for a while, because every time this skunk was walking around, couldn't see it, would run into a stump, and that would be it. So we didn't have any school next day, but somebody killed the skunk eventually, and that stopped that. But
People were frightened of the skunk, or the skunk had made such a smell?
Well, it was the smell, you see. That was the thing. You couldn't get near it. It was pretty grim. It was all the logging and everything was all horses. The lumber company had a big barn there with a lot of horses, and they used to run it. And one of the fellows, he's living in New Westminster now. His dad was millwright, and we were out, and he'd get a hold of a 22 somewhere, and he says, "Watch me scare that horse." So he up with 22, he's going to shoot between his ears, you know, and scare the horse, but he got him right between the eyes, and he killed him dead as a doornail. And his dad had to pay for the horse. So he wasn't very happy boy there for a couple of days. But it was a wonderful place to raise a family. I tell you, the berries, whenever we needed any money, we just went out and picked a bucket of berries and came in and sold them for 35 cents for a 3-pound bucket, 3-pound lard pail, you know. Huckleberries and that sort of thing, you know. Wonderful picnic country. It was a thing that, of course, the whole thing burnt down eventually. I don't know what happened.
Is that after you left?
Yes, it burnt down in 1914. We left in 1911. We moved to Nakusp. My dad was a barber, and, he wanted to get back at his own kind of work, and there was a pretty good offer there in Nakusp. A fellow that was getting old wanted to move, and so he'd gone and had a look at it, and he liked Nakusp. He liked the town. So he bought the place, and so we moved to Nakusp. And that was another good place to live.
Just before we go to Nakusp, there are one or two questions I'd like to ask.
Mm-hmm.
He was practicing barbering in Revelstoke.
In Revelstoke, yes. And in Comaplix, he used to, he had a shop in the Lardeau Hotel there, which was the pretty good-sized hotel for a mining town. And he used to open that up 3 nights a week. You see, 3 evenings a week. And he couldn't stay on his feet too long, so he had to, he had to take it easy with that. So, but there was no barber there. And so he had a shop in the hotel, in the lobby there. And we went up to Camborne from Comaplix one time, which was quite an important town in those days. Well, no, not at that time. It had been. It was on its way out. Camborne was closing down. And I remember going up there on an old buckboard and a team of horses. It just looked like this Dodge City on Gunsmoke, the old hotel. We were up there again last summer, and it's not much of the old place left now. Trout Lake was quite a big town then, too. It was quite busy. The mines were all working up and back of Beaton and that country. But Comaplix was strictly a logging country, and they had a lot of loggers in the woods. Selby Souls, Captain Selby Souls, who was on the tugs around there, he worked all over the Arrow Lakes and the Shuswap Lake. But talking to him in Vancouver, and I couldn't remember exactly, but he told me he thought there were about 500 men employed around Comaplix with the mills and that. And that was a very unusual thing in Comaplix. There were every nationality that you could imagine. There was a little settlement, just Japanese. And another little settlement were all Italians. Another settlement were Swedes and Norwegians. And then there was most of the, there was another group of little houses. The company owned all the houses, of course. And they were Americans, fellas that come up here from the States, young fellas. And the Doukhobors, about 1910, they sent a group in. There were about 15 or 20 of them, but they didn't stay very long. They worked in the sawmill for a while, just temporary, one summer there, and then they went out. And they had a big boarding house there. There were mostly Welshmen that stayed in that boarding house, as far as I can remember, because I used to collect stamps, and I'd go down there, run around these places getting stamps, and and this kid that had shot the horse, his folks had a couple of cows. That was the only milk there was in town, and he used to peddle milk around to the different places, you see, in a can and a quart measure, and or a pint measure rather, and he'd pour out the milk in these buckets that the people would leave out for him, and I'd go around with him quite often with that. And but all these different nationalities all had their own little settlements, sort of groups of houses that the company had, and it was quite interesting. There were only two hotels, the Queen's Hotel and the Lardeau Hotel. Russ Evans ran the Lardeau Hotel. His wife, by the way, was she was one of the ones that lost her life when the Empress of Ireland turned over in the St. Lawrence River there. She was on her way back to Sweden. She was Swede. And she was on her way back, and the boat tipped over, and in the river there, for some reason, nobody ever did know, I don't think. I don't know what was rammed.
It was rammed another boat.
Yeah. Well, anyway, she had some beautiful rings, and I've heard that they found her body on the beach, and her fingers had been cut off, just to take the rings off. The rings were gone, and her fingers were cut off. It was a peculiar thing. Her husband died. He married her niece, who went to school with us up there. They were the old wooden school desks in this little school. And
tell me about Comaplix. Where was it?
Well, it was right across the lake from Beaton. If you know where Beaton is, it was about 10 miles from Arrowhead, but across the lake from where Beaton is now. Like Beaton is was on one side of the end of the lake, and Comaplix was on the other side of the end of the lake. And they did build a road through from Beaton to Comaplix.
That'll be around the end.
Yes, around the end.
Because between Arrowhead and Comaplix, it's just...
Oh, yes, there was nothing. Although we expected the railroad to come through there any day, of course, as kids, we'd heard them talking about the railroad, and the CPR was intending to build through. They built through the Lardeau and up there, and they had a boat on Trout Lake, and they were supposed to build right through to Arrowhead and connect with the main line. And we heard that and had, we expected any day that railroad would be in there, of course, but the kids, we were waiting to see the trains come, but they never did come, and the CPR stopped there.
Why was it called Comaplix?
Well, there's a river runs into the head of the lake. Actually, it's in Comaplux, Incomapleux, the Incomaplux River. But they simplified it and called it Comaplix, Comaplix. It was the company store was there. And they had the post office in the store. It was strictly a company town, They had a few private houses, not too many. But there were a few houses. There weren't too many women in town. It was mostly a man's town, But
Was there a red light district there?
No, well, there was one. There was one house down by the wharf. Old Fan is all I ever knew her by. Was Old Fan, and I don't think she was old. But to us kids, she was old. I know we used to go down and sell her flowers. We'd pick wild roses, and she was always good for 50 cents for a bouquet of wild roses. So this kid that killed the horse there, and some of the others, if we wanted any, we could always get money. We could take a bouquet of roses into the bar room, and they'd give us a bottle of sarsaparilla, and that sort of thing. We had no trouble getting money. But Fan was killed. Old Fanny was killed. Uh, and nobody knows how. They never did find out who did it. But she used to come up to Chief Young, who ran the Queen's Hotel, uh, well, quite regularly for liquor, you see. That's where she bought her liquor. And she hadn't been up there for a couple of weeks. It was in the wintertime. An old chief said to a couple of fellows who had a trap line up Big Creek, which was just a little ways past there toward Airhead's way, and they were going to their trap line, and Chief Young asked them to drop in and see if old Fan was sick or anything, because she hadn't been up for a couple of weeks, and that was unusual. So the two fellows knocked at the door when they went by. Their trail went right by her place, you see. And they knocked at the front door, and nobody answered. They went around the back door and knocked. Nobody answered. So they went and looked in the window, the kitchen window, and here she was lying on their floor with her head bashed in. There was blood all over the place. And apparently there'd been quite a fight, because there was blood scattered from one end of the house to the other. But they never did find out, as far as I know, they never found out who did it, or what the reason was, or anything else. It was just one of those things. She was buried up there in the churchyard, or not the graveyard rather, and that was the end of that. Nobody took her place. And so, but she was the only one there.
I suppose the company wouldn't permit such things, is that right?
Well, I won't imagine I don't think they had any objection. After all, those days, that was the Western living was. That was all part of living out here. There were very few women out in the country, and these women, they apparently served their purpose. Most of them were very good to the miners and the loggers and that. If they needed any money, all they had to do was go down to one of these women and they'd grub stake them. In fact, there were very many. A lot of them used to do that, and while they weren't held in too high regard, a lot of the old miners, they thought a lot about them. From my experience, anyway, they'd talk about them. There was one in Slocan City there that used to. My wife had her dad had the store in Slocan City, the T. McNish Company there, and every Christmas, this woman who had a house, there were 2 or 3 houses in Slocan City, and this one would get out to the store, and she'd get him to one side, and she'd slip him $300-400 and tell him to make up hampers for 2 or 3 or 4 of these families that were up against it and had big families. And she says, don't tell her anything where it come from. You just send it up there Christmas morning. And she says they need it. There were women like that. Molly Brown, that was in Sandon, and Caslow was another one. That she grub-staked an awful lot of miners, and she was beat out of every nickel she had. An outfit in Salt Lake City that just took her money and didn't do anything for it.
Did any of these women in grub-staking prospectors, did they ever make any money?
Oh, no, it was just they didn't really grub-stake them for the purpose of making. They just gave them the money and then hoped that they would give it back, and most of the fellows used to give it back to them. When they got around to getting any money, they'd give it back to them. And
Comaplix, was it in the valley, or what was it?
Well, no, it was just on the side of the mountain. There was a little bit of a valley. Well, it wasn't really a valley. I guess it was just a wide bank. I guess a wide beach, although there were trees on it. And then the flats, the head of the lake, you see, and the trees came down so far, and then it was sand beyond that, and it was pretty rocky. And now, I've found out since that it's all covered up, or most of it is covered up. There was a slide came down the mountain and covered it up. I was there a few years ago, and I couldn't understand how a town there was the Comaplix that I knew, and I have a picture of it, and I couldn't understand how that town could ever be on a place that it looks like that now. And the piling are still out in the lake where the sawmill was located. But the rest of the place, it didn't look right at all, although after all, that's 50 years ago since we left there, and I flew over it by plane, and it didn't look right to me. And Don Thompson, he's my neighbor here, he was flying the plane, this Pacific Western Airlines plane here, and I flew over it with him, and he went quite low too, to see if he could get any landmarks. but I couldn't. Well, then I find out from Captain Souls in New Westminster when I was talking to him here 2 years ago that a slide came down and covered most of what used to be the town. So it's little wonder that it doesn't look like it used to. They had a wonderful ball team there. They beat everything. Of course, they collected ball players in the sawmill, and there was a big sort of a slough there, and the company hauled slabs in there and sawdust, and they filled that slough, and then they hauled a couple of feet of gravel and put on top of it and made a ball ground out of it, because there was no place for a ball ground, and it was an artificially built ball ground, but it was a good one. And the houses that were around it, they made shields, to cover the windows with, so they wouldn't be hit with any fly balls or foul balls or anything. And they played there. My dad was quite a good ball player. He played a sort of a semi-pro ball in Winnipeg when he was a young fellow, and he caught for that team there. They beat everything around the country. They had a wonderful ball team. They traveled around Revelstoke and Kamloops. They used to go around and play ball, and of course lots of them would come up there. And on celebration days, 24th of May, 1st of July, well, there were always someplace between Nakusp and Arrowhead and Comaplix. There were big celebrations, and they'd always have a big ball tournament. And some of these teams were quite good. Some of these fellows. One of the pitcher for Comaplix, he went to Vancouver to pitch ball down there. I don't know how he ever made out. A fellow named Darcy Costigan. And but he was a good pitcher. He was the accountant for the sawmill.
Are there any other incidents about the Comaplix? Anything else before we go into the account?
Well, I don't know anything else particularly about Comaplix that.
Anything about your school life there?
Well, the school was yes, we had a small school. As I said, there were about 12 or 13 in it. We had a number of teachers, Miss Patrick, Miss Crandall, and Miss Johnson. That's it. And Miss Johnson, they were the ones that I could remember mostly. There was another one from Revelstoke, but I can't remember her name. She was the first one we had there. And they used that little school for pretty nearly everything. They used to hold church services in there whenever a preacher happened to show up in town. It might be a Catholic service this Sunday. It might be Methodist 2 weeks from now. But they didn't come too often. But every once in a while, the minister would come around and they'd have service in there. And then the school would have the big box stove in the middle of the room. When the weather was really cold, the teacher would get us all huddled around this big box stove. And that's where we'd have the class. We wouldn't sit in our seats. We'd just huddle around. And she was in the wintertime, it would get pretty cold, We just huddle around this stove, and we'd all have our classes and have a good boiling fire going there. And that was it. Yeah.
Is Comaplix the sort of place that's shut in very much with mountains and so on?
No, it's right on the beach. You see, it was right on the beach, and then there was a sort of a draw went back. Sort of back into the mountains a bit. There was a mining tunnel along this road that went back. And there was a fellow named Billy Gerard, had a little farm back there. And in fact, I think he has some sons living in Trail. And then Blaney's farm was further. The Blaney family practically was wiped out. They ate wild parsnips or something, and they killed them all but one. They all died. The ptomaine poi or whatever they get from wild parsnips. And the one survivor lived in Revelstoke afterwards. But they weren't. There wasn't much farm to it, Billy Gerard worked in the mill mostly, but he had a little farm and he sold little produce around there. He was a fellow who was getting on.
The logs would come down from the valleys and the streams.
Well, no, their logging was mostly done on the lake, and up this in Comaplix River, which they'd get the logs and they'd run them down the river. And there's certain season of the year, these salmon, the dog salmon they used to call them. Some of them were 6, 7 feet long, and they'd swarm up this fish river they used to call it, and. The thing was full of these huge fish. Of course, they haven't come up there now. I suppose all these dams have stopped all that, you see. But they used to come up there and swarm up these, up this creek, you know, or Fish River it was, and at a certain time of the year. And then the lake used to freeze every winter. And one winter, I can remember they used to have to, it froze so hard that winter that they had to haul supplies in from Arrowhead with a team of horses and a sleigh on the ice. And just one day, just as they got into Comaplix, or pretty close to the beach there, both horses went through the ice. They got one out, but the other one drowned. Of course, we kids were all around there watching everything. We never missed anything, you know. Yeah, we caught this helldiver, and then we tied a string on its leg, quite a long cord on the leg, and then we took it down at the wharf and we threw it into the water, you see. Well, of course, it immediately dived down, and when we thought it had been down there long enough, we pulled on the string and put it back up again. And this kept up to fire the string broke, so this poor helldiver, I suppose, ran around there and got tangled up someplace, but we did that for quite a while, this helldiver, and wouldn't let it stay down there.
What's a helldiver?
Well, it's something like a loon, only smaller, or mud hen, some of them call them, but the helldiver, I guess, is the name I've seen, and is one of the names for them, but they're not as big as a loon. They have a very fine white downy breast on them, and their legs are set so far back that they can't walk. They're strictly a marine bird, and their wings are so small that they can't fly, so they're just in the water all the time. But they dive down, and they'll be down for quite a while, except this one. It used to come up when we were ready for it. Well, I guess it was another name for them would be mud hen. But it was that was what, you know, it was just the kind of things that kids used to do. Sit on a plank, and there were a lot of planks around there, and we'd paddle all around the edge of the lake and all that. Well, if my kids ever did that, I'd be scared to death. But we were playing. Nobody paid much attention to us. Nobody ever got drowned, and we had lots of fun, you know, doing these sort of things.
You soon learned to swim, I suppose.
Oh, well, I didn't learn to swim. My brother, he could swim like a fish, but I never did learn to swim. I lived in the lake all my life and never learned to swim. But I don't know, I wasn't much on going, and used to go down a little bit once in a while, you know, but not much on swimming. A little dog paddling is about all I ever learned to do, and whether I would have drowned or not, I don't know.
You played on these planks anyway.
Oh, yeah, we used to straddle the plank and get a paddle and paddle all around. Of course, the plank was a big 12-inch plank and 2 and 3 inches thick and about 12, 16 feet long, you know. It would float anything. That we were only little kids, you know. Well, 9, 10 years old. And we'd paddle all over the lake with these things, you know, and run around the flats. Remember another thing we did was one time catch a snake on the flats there. We didn't know anything about what it was or anything. A water snake, I suppose it was, but we just pick it up by the tail and twist it around our head and let it go out into the lake. And it would swim into shore. As soon as it swam into shore, we caught it and threw it out again. It kept doing this thing till the poor thing just rolled up and sank. But then we had an argument one day about whether chickens could swim. And the Hindus, they used to... I don't know whether I mentioned, we had Hindus there too. There was quite a selection of Hindus along with these different nationalities, and they all kept chickens because they used to eat a lot of chicken. So we caught a couple of their chickens one day, and we threw them out into the lake to see if they could swim. Well, they got into shore all right. They were just mated because their feathers aren't made for floating, but they got into shore. So we settled that.
Now, then you went to Nakusp.
We went to Nakusp.
You were how old when you went to Nakusp?
I was 11 years old when we went to Nakusp. Well, not quite 11. I was 11 in October, and we went in August.
Tell me, just to give us an impression of how Nakusp struck you coming from the other place. In what year? 1911.
1911.
Oh, I didn't.
Yes, 1911 we went to Nakusp, and, well, we thought Nakusp was quite a town after Comaplix, and it was a very friendly town. we found it a very friendly town, and I don't know, we seemed to settle in there right away. And of course, my folks, they thought Nakusp was a wonderful place. And mind you, it was just another small town in British Columbia, and I think any place in British Columbia would have appealed to them. They just liked this country. That was all. There were lots of creeks, there were lots of trees, there were mountains, there were wild flowers, and well, after the prairie, they couldn't get over this, and there was a canyon out there. Every Sunday we were out at the canyon for a picnic, and Nakusp was well, there were a lot of different activities, and I left Nakusp after I went away for a while then to high school. You know high school, you see, and I passed entrance class there. They used to call it in those days was entrance. Now it's grade 8, and so then I went back to Revelstoke for a year to go to high school, and
what year would that be?
That'd be yes, that was before the war.
About 14.
That would be in 1912. I went to Revelstoke. And then I came back there, and it was in 1914. They were working on this railroad to Caslo. The CPR had taken over the old K&S railroad that had been running into Caslo, and they were rebuilding it into a standard gauge. And I got into the band. My dad got me into the band, and I was about 13. And just after I came back from high school, he used to play in the band, and he thought that was a fine thing, and I do think it's a swell thing for kids to play in a band. And I was in the band, and we used to go on excursions, like up to Comaplix. They'd take the ball team up there. They'd charter one of the boats, the Minto or the Kootenai, and they'd fill that boat from one end to the other, and the band would be on board, of course, playing all the way up to Comaplix and back, or up to Arrowhead or down to Burton City. They were always chartering boats and going someplace. There were no cars. And but anyway, this 1914, on the 1st of July, they ran the first train from Caslo to Nakusp. A big celebration there that day. There was a special boat from Comaplix and Arrowhead, and a special one that brought Revelstoke people down, and one from Burton. And then this train came over loaded to the gunnels with people from Caslo and Denver and Silverton. And when the boat went by, or the train rather, went by coming into town, we had our little band up there on the bank playing Hail the Conquering Hero Comes, as the train roared by. And Bert Herridge, who is now a member of Parliament, for he and I were playing in that band at that time. And hot, it was a hot day, and there were people every place you looked, there were people. A wonderful community spirit was there at that time. I don't know what it's like now, but at that time it was wonderful. We cleared the ballpark that they have there now. The CPR, it was CPR land, and they, well, I don't think it was all CPR land, but some of it was, and some belonged to the town site people, I think. Anyway, it was contributed to given to the community for a recreation ground. But it was all trees and that, and they used to have big bees out there in the evening. Every evening there was a crowd out there, and the women were making tea and coffee and lunches, and the fellas were cutting down trees and piling them up in piles and burning them. And we really had a ball there fixing that recreation ground, and they're really doing a job up there now with it. And that day they played ball with everybody. All the ball teams were there. It was always a good ball town. And they had all these sports. They used to have races up and down Broadway there. The Indians used to come up from Burton and bring their horses up. And they usually won the races. They had pretty good horses. And they'd race up the street there. Of course, it was quite a common thing around here in those days to have horse races in the street. Caslo did it, Nelson did it, and Nakusp did it.
I want to ask you about Nakusp. What did you play in the band? What did you play?
I played a cornet. I played the cornet. I started off in the trombone, but they needed a cornet more than they needed a trombone. And I had a cornet because my dad used to play a cornet one time, so I had one, which helped a little bit. And they could get somebody else working on this trombone that they had in the band, and I used my own cornet, so I played the cornet in.
What did Harry play?
He played the bass. And, we had a lot of good times in that band. Sam Henry was a Chinese gardener there, and had a big garden at the lower end of town, beautiful ground there. And Sam had 2 wives, a young one and an old one. And anyway, he died. So they really had a funeral and a half. They brought the, he was quite wealthy, you see, so of course everything was done. And especially in those days, they used to do things on a bigger scale, everybody, than they do nowadays. Now they try to keep funerals down, but in those days there was quite a bit of show to a funeral. And Sam, he was no exception, or at least his people weren't. And they got the Chinese band down from Revelstoke to play in the funeral, and they hired the local band to play in the funeral. So they had, this thing stretched down there for a long ways, and they had a fellow running ahead with little pieces of paper, little square pieces of paper, and he was tossing them every so often. He'd toss one around. Now, we were wondering what that was for, but the explanation given to us, whether it was true or not, I don't know, but it was that each one of these had a little pinhole in it, and the devil had to crawl through each one of these papers before he could get to the grave, and by that time he'd be gone, you see. So it was to hold up, to kind of sort of delay the thing. Well, we started playing the Dead March and Saul along, but the man in charge of the funeral, he came up to, he says, lots of noise, lots of noise, lots of noise. So we started playing Officers of the Day March, and that was fine. That's just what they wanted. And we'd play a number, and then the Chinese band from Revelstoke would play one. They were, of course, they had a lot of drums and things, so they were mounted on a big wagon, and we had to walk. And Bob Greed was a drummer, and we had another fellow, George Tillett. He was a peculiar duck, and he was playing, both these fellows were pretty comical. And one played the trombone, George Tillett played the trombone, and old Bob played the bass drum. And neither one thought the other could play, I don't think, but Tillett, he come along, and when he went out with his trombone, he pushed it out, and of course he hit Bob with it. Well, of course, that set Bob back, so Tillett, he stopped and he hollered over to the conductor, look at that fella, he said he's spoiling everything. He won't walk fast enough. But we got there, and they had a big ceremony. They had 3 ministers. Every minister that they could get, they had him there at the cemetery, and they had a big ceremony there, and then everybody went home. They had a regular, they hadn't dug a grave. There was just a mound there, and they put all their things on the mound. I remember there was roast duck was one of the things, and quite a number of things like that. But then they took the body back. After all the ceremony was over, they took the body back to the undertaking parlor and left him there. He was there for 4 years or so. Because just after that, the war started. You see, to begin with, you had to wait. They were going to send him back to China, and you had to wait for a boat. Well, then, before they could get a boat for him, the war started, and then he had to wait till after the war was over before he could get it. So the undertaker had him there for over 4 years. And every day or so, he'd go in and wipe him off and fix him up and keep him in shape there until they finally moved him. But that was quite a parade. We had a band of about, I think at the most it had 18, I guess. It was about the biggest we ever had. We used to play Christmas time. We go around playing carols, try to raise a little money to buy some music and one thing or another. Remember, we went and serenaded the Anglican minister, and we were playing out there, and I don't know, you may have heard, his dad was Chief Justice of England, Phillimore, Chief Justice Phillimore of England. Well, this was the young Phillimore. He was the Anglican minister there. and of course quite a wealthy family. But we played for a while. Finally, Fillmore came out and he gave the leader $5, and he says, "You're doing very well, fellas." He says, "I wonder if you'd mind going play over in the other block." So maybe we weren't very good players, I don't know. We went up to another fella up in the Glenbank, what they call up in the hill there. Went up there, and we were as cold as the dickens, you know. And most of these places, we'd go in and at least we'd get a cup of coffee out of it or something, or get a drink. Well, I didn't get any drink because I was too young, but the rest of them were. And we went to one fella's house there, Tom Bowes. He was quite a wag anyway, I guess. But anyway, we played for quite a while, and we're getting pretty cold and playing away, and nothing was happening. And finally, Tom Bowes stuck his head out the door and says, "You're doing fine, fellas. Keep it up." And shut the door and went back in. But the band was quite an asset at that. And Nakusp had a band right from that time until Jack Bailey died here. Let's see, it's 2 years ago now. Well, Jack Bailey, he was in that band. He was playing a second cornet along with me. And we had a good conductor. He used to conduct bands in England, and he was a good player and a good conductor. And then he went away, and then Jack took over. And Jack kept a band of sorts going there in Nakusp until he died. Sometimes it was a pretty rugged struggle, but he kept a band going there, and they always had a band for the 1st of July, which is their celebration day. And sometimes he'd play in New Denver, but he struggled away and he kept the band going. And they understand when he died, they had a little write-up about him in the Canadian Bandsman. He was the oldest, in point of service, the oldest bandsman in Canada, or band leader, rather, in Canada, in point of service.
Did you wear a uniform?
No, we just wore our ordinary clothes, and we used to go out quite often and play for various things. You know, we didn't get any money out of it. It was just, the fun. We had a good dramatic club in Nakusp. It was that was another thing that was, an asset to the little town. We had a nice dramatic club, put on many good plays there. Dave Bulger, who was one of the pioneers in the country, his brother, Jim Bulger, came in here first. He was brought in here by the I think it was the Kootenai Columbia Navigation Company, about 96 or something, 97, to build steamers. They were a Newfoundland family who had moved to Portland. And Jim come up here. Well, then he brought his brother up, Dave. And Dave was quite interested in dramatics, and he was a pretty good actor. And he ran the shipyard at Nakusp then. And we had this dramatic club, and we used to put on some good plays, and we had a lot of interesting times in that. There was one fellow one night, I know, he'd never been in a play in his life, and he struggled through the first act of this play that night, and he was nervous. Oh, he was scared to death all the way through. And as soon as the first act was over, he went out the back door of the theater, and he never did come back. So luckily somebody could fill in the part to finish it off, but he wouldn't come back. They couldn't find him. They didn't know where he was. And the first place they had there to put on plays was up above Abriel's office. They had a little hall up there, and there was no dressing room. You had to climb a ladder through a trap door into the attic up underneath the eaves there, and they were using that for dressing room, and the women were going to dress just in the back of the stage. So there was one woman in there. Well, she wasn't going to change her clothes in front of anybody, that was for sure. So they put up a curtain in one corner so she could change her clothes behind there. Well, the night of the play come along, she got so excited and everything, she changed her clothes out there, and nobody paid any attention to her or anything else. Everybody else was just as excited as she was, And but she got by all right. Nobody bothered her, and she didn't go behind the curtain.
What were the plays that you put on?
Well, there was the private secretary was one. They were old, of course, that's a long time ago. The private secretary, Captain Racket, Sweet Lavender, What Happened to Jones, Facing the Music, and The Girl from Puerto Rico. There were Oh, then we had some Macbeth or some scenes from Shakespearean plays. You know, we wouldn't put the whole play on, but we'd put some scenes on from them. And we even went from Shakespeare to a minstrel show, and you know, we did all kinds of things, and there were some of them were quite good. You know, we had our laughs, you know, and that, and you'd run into some of them were quite. Some had quite a bit of experience. Others hadn't had any at all.
What kind of lighting did you have?
It was gasoline lamps, and I can still smell those gas lamps in that opera house there. They used to have the little hand lamps, gasoline lamps that you pumped up individually, and they were set in holes in the stage in the front for footlights, and then there was a tin reflector placed in the back of them, and that was what the light was.
Didn't they make a lot of noise?
Well, there was a bit of a hissing noise with them, but that's what anybody that had lamps at home had those, so you were used to it and didn't pay much attention to it. It wasn't loud enough to bother anything because at least nobody seemed to notice it anyway, if it was. Nowadays they might, but in those days they didn't.
What kind of scenery did they have?
We had good scenery. That was the nice thing. Mr. Bulger, Dave Bulger, of course, being the foreman of the shipyard, they had lots of canvas in the shipyard, and they had lots of painters, and they had one fellow in there, Joe Bradford, who was an excellent painter, and he was not only a painter of boats, but he painted pictures, and he was also a scene painter, and every play we had new scenery. Since the CPR supplied the canvas, I don't know, but they paint. But we had new scenery every time we had a new play.
The curtain, the front curtain, what kind of a curtain?
Well, it was a canvas, and it was painted, and it was covered with ads from the local merchants. All the local merchants had an ad on the front curtain. And it rolled up. It was canvas, and it rolled up, you see. And
from the bottom?
Yes, it rolled up from the bottom. There was a double rope affair, and from one side it would roll up. The dressing rooms weren't, there weren't any, actually. They were just the both sides of the stage, and the men used one side and the women used the other in the far. It was adequate, but not good, you know.
This is a community hall?
Yes, it was Tom Abriel's Hall, it was called. The Opera House, actually, is what it was called, the Opera House. It started off as a dramatic club project, and a number of them contributed funds, and they started to build it. Well, then it was going to be too much. They couldn't finance it. So Tom Abriel took it over, and he finished the hall, and then he rented it. He always claimed he lost money on it, but I don't know whether he did. Of course, he used to charge up so much for himself for manager, and so much insurance, which he paid himself, and so much fuel, and of course he sold the wood, and so much for janitor, and he did the janitor work. But the overall operation, the hall lost money, but actually, I guess he made out all right on it. But,
who was this chap?
Tom Abriel? Well, he was one of the early pioneers in Nakusp. He came in there right when the town started, about 92, 93, when they started building that railroad across. That's when the town started. And he became agent for the town site company, and he sold their lots. And he sort of branched off into pretty nearly anything. He'd buy anything. That's what he started at. And then, of course, he put in insurance and real estate. And then he was agent for the Imperial Oil Company, I think. He had a store. He bought out the old Yale Lumber Company. After the lumber company sold out, well, they knew Outfit didn't want the store, so Tom Abriel bought their store. And he even owned the Grand Hotel for a little while when somebody wanted to move away, so he bought the hotel and ran it for a while. Somebody else was in there. Somebody ran the bar and somebody ran the dining room. And then he sold that. But, you know, he'd build houses around town and rent them. And actually, he was quite a good citizen, you know, in his way. He wasn't married. And
Yes. You remember Jordan's store? That was
Yes, F.W. Jordan had one of the first stores there. There were a number, but I think he had one of the first. Bourne's had a store too, but F.W. Jordan had quite a good sized store. He had one of the big stores in the area, in the Slocan area. He had the big store in Nakusp. Henry Gigrick had the big one in Caslow. Tom Hoban had the one in New Denver, and T.H. Wilson in Silverton, and Tom McNish, my wife's father, had the one in Slocan City. And they in those days, those fellas had big stores. They'd get a carload of canned goods in, and they'd get them all the way from Hamilton, Ontario, because they weren't canning anything around here, and that sort of thing. In those days, you tried to see how big a stock you could get in, and then you had a big store. Nowadays, they try to keep it down as low as they can and keep replenishing. But transportation being what it was in those days, they used to have to have a store. And F.W. Jordan had a big store. His wife, I guess she's still alive. She's the oldest. I guess she's the only one left. The first woman in Nakusp is left. She's still in Nakusp. She's pretty old. Did you see her over there? Yeah. She's quite an old lady. She's a fine old woman. An old lady, Mrs. Jordan.
Very, quite a lot of character.
Yes. Yeah, she's a fine woman.
What about Jordan? What sort of man was he?
Well, he wasn't well. I think he had diabetes, if I remember. And he wasn't well. He was quite a very refined kind of a fellow, and quite a nice man. But he wasn't as active as he might have been if he'd have had better health. He was a justice of the peace there for years and that sort of thing. But he couldn't, he couldn't take a fact. He used to have one comic song he always sang at all the things, and everybody always waited for F.W. Jordan to sing. Everybody always called him F.W. to sing this song.
What was the song?
Oh, something about the cat's got the toothache, gum boil, belly ache, pain in his left leg, pimple on his tail,
Go on.
But I don't know how it goes. The cat's got the toothache, gum boil, belly ache, pain in his left leg, pimple on his tail. That's all I can remember. He used to sing this thing, about all these maladies that cat had, and he'd go on and on and on with this thing, And he'd get a little grin on his face, and he'd sing this, and all the kids would love it, at these Christmas tree concerts. He usually sang it at the Christmas tree concert, the KP Christmas tree concert. And they'd always get him to sing that. But he was one of the old-timers from there. Lyle McDougall was another, a wonderful violin player, Lyle McDougall. That is quite good violin player. His dad built the old Leland Hotel that's there now. And but Lyle never did run it. His mother ran it for quite a while. He died in Vancouver here a few years ago. And but he used to play for the dancers, play the violin, and he was quite a good violinist. And he was one of the old timers there. He came there as just a young boy from San Francisco. I think they came from somewhere down there.
Tell more about Sam Henry.
Well, let's see. Sam Henry, I don't know that. Except that he ran the garden, and he was quite he was always quite ready to contribute to anything around town, but outside of that, I don't know of anything unusual that happened.
Do you remember about his two wives at home?
Well, one was old, and she ran the roost. He went back to China and got this second wife. She was a young one, but the old one still ran the roost, and the young one had to work out in the garden and with the rest of them. And when the young one had a child, and the old woman, she just took over, and she took the child. That was it. And it was, well, I suppose that's the way they did it. In Revelstoke, there was a Chinese old Wing Chung there, and he had two wives, and the older one always was the boss. And I remember his first one died, and then the youngest one he had became the old one, you see, because he married another one then. So he always had two. And then the younger one, so the one who had been the younger one to start with, she became the old one, and she was the boss around there. And that was in Revelstoke, in Wing Chun. He was one of the, quite an outstanding Chinese merchant there in the old days. But Sam Henry, outside of his funeral, I don't know of anything unusual, except that he had a good garden.
Did he wear a pigtail?
Yes. Yes, he had a pigtail, but I think he cut it off before he died. You see, it was after that revolution there in China, where there was a change in China, and they cut them off, and I think he did cut his off. But it seems to be when we first went there that he had one. I wouldn't be too sure of that, but I think he did. It seems to me, I remember, he used to kind of keep it curled up around his head. It didn't hang down. And he wore a great big wide black hat all the time, quite a wide hat. Do
you remember Mrs. Moffat?
Mrs. Moe, yeah, I knew Mrs. Moffat very well. She was, when the band played, that was one place where we not only got a cup of coffee, we got a piece of pie when we played at in front of Mrs. Moffat's house. And she came in there first to work at the hotel, the Leland Hotel, and then she opened up a laundry and bathhouse. And she stayed in that same building, well, not the same, well, pretty nearly till she died. She moved across the street, and just before, not too long before she died, she lived a while there in another house. But she was there for years and years. And she was one of these kind of women that she'd ball the daylights out of you and then give you a piece of pie, you know. The kids rather, what are you kids doing here, you know? She said, get out of here now. Before you go here, have a donut. You know, that sort of woman. Her bark was worse than her bite, you know. She was a very fine woman, Mrs. Moffat. Well, Mrs. Moffat, she wasn't very tall, and she was rather plumpish woman with sharp features. She wore glasses. Had a very, very sharp nose, if I remember rightly. And, well, her mouth was, well, you might say it was a sort of a stern sort of a mouth, but still she always had there was a twinkle in her eye all the time, you know, that made the difference. And I guess that's where it was. She was always kidding you when she'd do her, when she was bawling these kids out, you know. It was all part of the game with her, you know. And
were you actually frightened of her?
No, nobody was ever frightened of Miss Moffat, and the louder she hollered at you, the more you liked her, you know. She was that kind of a woman. You know, she was a great woman.
She kept people in order too, I think, to some extent.
I beg your pardon?
She kept people in order.
Oh yes, yeah. She'd say what she thought. She was one of these sharp-tongued women that said what she thought, and if she didn't like something that was going on, she just said so. So I know she wasn't a mixer or a joiner. She didn't belong to the Women's Institute or the Ladies' Aid or anything like that, as far as I know. But everybody knew her, and of course she made sure that everybody knew her, because she'd talk to anybody as though she'd known them for years. She'd meet a stranger, you know, and that was all. She'd talk. And
did she have the only bath in town?
Well, I think so. Well, not. I think at that time when she built the bath, it was the only one in town. And I know we had a bathtub, and that was from more of an accident than anything, I guess. My dad having a barber shop in Comaplix, and there was no bath there, so he had he'd had a bathroom fixed up in this barber shop, you see. So, of course, he had the bathtub when he came to the Nakusp, so we set it up. Had a bathroom. We built this house and had a bathroom in it. But it wasn't the common, regular thing to have baths, you know. Most people used a tub in the kitchen and the wash tub. And in those days, there weren't, because to begin with, when we went there was no water. We had to haul all the water. Tom Abriel, that was another thing he did. There was a spring up there, and he used to sell water from this spring for 25 cents a barrel to people, because there was no water in town. There hadn't any water system, you see. And there was a spring up there, and he had this fella haul water around and sell it.
Did you ever go out to the hot springs?
Oh, yes. I spent a lot of time up there at the hot springs. We used to have to walk up, take 3 hours about to walk up. And fellow there, the Sutherlands, they had a horse, and a pack horse, and you'd load your pack on that, pay them $1, and you took the horse up to the hot springs, unloaded your pack, turned the horse loose, and he came back home. You see, it'd take about 3 hours to go up there. And in those days, of course, it was just a hole in the rock with an old log shack over the top of it. There were 2 bathhouses, and they were just like that. Of course, the Board of Trade afterwards built a cement thing. It wasn't very big, and it's all shot now. I think it's gone to rack and ruin. But we used to fish up there. I went up there with another fellow, a couple of kids. We were about 14, I guess. And all we took with us was a sack, a little bag, about 10 pounds of flour and baking powder and salt, all mixed together in this bag, and another little bag, can it was, with some sugar in it, and a tin plate, and a spoon, and a cup, and that's all we took, and a frying pan, of course, and we got into a little, dug a hole in the bank alongside of the creek up there, Kuskanook Creek, and we'd roll up in the blanket. We'd each had a blanket, and we'd roll up in there and sleep. And in the morning, we'd build a little campfire, and we'd mix some water with this dough, with this flour, and make a bannock. And while one fellow was doing that, the other fellow was down at the creek catching enough fish for breakfast. And you had no trouble catching the fish. There were brook trout, there were all kinds of them there, and that's what we lived on. And then there were a lot of huckleberries around there, so we'd get huckleberries and cook them with the sugar and drink water. And we stayed up there for a week.
Is this at the hot springs?
Yes, up the hot springs.
How, you talked about these 2 little bathhouses. Was there no swimming pool?
No, there was just a hole in the ground. Oh, one of them, I don't think it was any more than 6 feet long. And there were 2 great big rocks, and this water was sort of in between them. They sort of dammed it up there, and the water ran in there. It runs out of the ground, you see, and runs down, and was in there. And nobody ever wore a bathing suit or anything up there. You just went in. And
only men went up there anyway.
Well, no, there were a lot of women up there, but they'd always alternate. There were a lot of women went up there. They'd camp up there, you know. And you knew if there was anybody in the bathhouse. Well, of course, there were 2 of them, and sometimes one bunch would go in one, and another. You couldn't go in more than about 3 or 4 at a time in one of these things. And hot, it was so hot, you know, that it would take you 15, 20 minutes to get into it, and then once you got in, you daren't move because it was so warm. Now, there was where it used to run out of the rock in one place there, you could boil eggs in it. You could put your eggs in there and take them out and boiled. And it was a funny thing. This hot water then was running down towards the creek, and there was another creek about, 4 or 5 feet away from it, and it was ice cold, that water was. But it was a wonderful place up there. And it was a real wild country. You couldn't get up there. That was a nice thing about it. It took you 3 hours to get up there. There was no telephone. There was no nothing when you got up there. You just, you were away from everything. People used to... Oh, I know a fellow who was a lawyer in the prairie. He used to come up there every year, and he'd spend 2 weeks up there, and nobody could get at him or anything else. If they sent a telegram, you had to wait till somebody was going up there to get it up to you, you know. So.
Any other personalities that should be mentioned from around the town?
Well, Doc Laval was a very unusual fellow there. He was a doctor, but he never practiced. He tended bar. He was just always around town. I don't know what he did, unless he had a little money. And then he went off to the war when the first war, you know. And when he came back, I think he went as a doctor. And when he came back, he was practicing at the coast. But he was an unusual sort of fellow. He was, I think he was quite a good doctor. But why he didn't practice, I don't know. And he was quite popular with everybody. He was around all the time and didn't seem to do anything. And there were a lot of remittance men around in those days. One fellow was a fellow named Hudson. And they said he was a professor of forestry at Oxford University. And I guess there wasn't anything he couldn't tell you about a tree. But if he tried to cut one down, he'd chop his leg off. He was the most, well, I don't know what you call it, but impractical man I ever saw. I used to play billiards with him, and I liked him. He was a fine fellow, and we used to have lots of fun playing billiards. He was up at Fostall, which was just up the lake a piece there, and this Canadian Dominion Development Company, which was an English company that was selling supposed to be fruit farms to these Englishmen over there, and some of them you couldn't. Well, they used to have a joke that this fella bought this fruit farm and he fell off it into the lake 3 times the first day because it was just a side hill. You couldn't. But they were selling these things, these fellas. Well, he came out to Fostall to grow fruit. Well, he got himself a little cabin built up there, and he came into town one day and he was quite excited, and he was telling me all about it. He nearly shot a bear. He says, I nearly shot him through the window. He says, I looked out the window, and there was the bear. He says, I didn't want to open the window for fear I'd frighten him, so I shot him through the window. He says, I broke the window, but I missed the bear. Afterwards, he went down to Victoria, and he got a job with the forest branch down there, and I imagine he was a valuable man with the forest branch. But he certainly was starved to death growing fruit.
Doc Laval, you say he tended bar?
He tended bar there, yes, and yes, he did all kinds of things like that around, and he'd have lots of fun doing it. He was one of these kind of fellows. He was always laughing, and happy-go-lucky sort of fella. And
what was his first name?
I don't know. I don't know what his name was. Doc Laval was all I ever heard him called. I don't know.
The Undertaker. Oh yes, do you remember Crowell, the Undertaker?
Oh yeah, yes. He was the fellow that looked after Sam Henry, and he used to have I know my dad used to go over with him once in a while to have a look at him. My dad and he were, well, I don't know, they weren't chummy, but they liked each other, it seemed like. And Crowell, until he went to war, he had a woodworking place there, and he was the undertaker. And I think he's up there now. He's back again. I saw him a few years ago. Oh, he's around 80 years old now. And he was down here going back to his old home back in New Brunswick. And I saw him down at the bus depot. He says, I haven't been back there, he says, for 50 years. But he says, I'm going now, he says, and I'm going to go every 10 years from now on. So he's going to have a few trips out of it. But he had a brother there too, Flet Crowell. And Joe had sold out to Ernie Summers, who had a blacksmith shop. And he showed him a few tricks of the trade there on the undertaking and sold out to him when he went to the war. Harry Hughes was around. He was the first fellow I ever saw go to war. I was only a kid and the war broke out. And I remember Harry Hughes was working on the boats there, fireman on the Wat-Shan. And he was on the reserves in England, apparently. And as soon as the war broke out, of course, he was called up. And Harry was going off. Well, that was quite a thing for me to see a fellow going to war. I'd never seen anybody go to war, never heard about a war. And the only thing I could imagine about a fellow going to war was a fellow on a big white horse with a saber in his arms, a hand waving it up in the air. And I couldn't imagine Harry Hughes doing anything like that. He was a slight sort of a fellow and very well, full of fun. He used to sing at these concerts or something or other. In fact, I was pallbearer for him here last year when he died up here. He finally passed away up here in the hospital with cancer, I think. And but he went off to war, and I remember he went in. The war was declared in August, and he was right away. And he wrote to my dad. I think I still have the letter there that it would all be over by November. Of course, he didn't say which November, but it was all going to be over. They'd have it all over with pretty quick. And there was Captain Forsland. He was an old-timer. He was on the boats. He used to run the old steamer Revelstoke, from Revelstoke up to the Big Bend country, and they had a good one on him. He had a great habit of saying for he'd never say them or it or I or anything. Everything was And when the Duke of Connaught made a tour through this country. Captain Forsland was captain on this special boat they had for him, you see, and it was a beautiful day. The sun was shining. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, and Forsland, of course, he didn't care for anybody. He was up in the pilot house minding his own business, and the Duke was on the boat. Well, that was fine. It was a special boat, and they had a red coat at every door and all this sort of thing when we saw it go by there. And so the Duke went upstairs into the pilot house to have a look around up there, and so the captain didn't say anything. He just was steering his boat. And the Duke finally, he thought he'd start a little conversation, I guess. He says, "It looks like rain, doesn't it?" Captain says, "Like hell 'em do." That ended the conversation right there. The Duke decided he better go downstairs again. But,
any more stories about Forsland?
No, that's the only story I know about Forsland. I don't. I worked around Nakusp there at the CPR when he was on the boats, but I don't know of any particular stories about him at the time.
Was the Bonington being built when you were there?
Oh no, it was already built. It had already been launched. There's some little dispute. I wanted to try and look that up. I thought it was 1910. The Bonington was launched, and my sister was telling me it was 1911. So I have to check that because I'd like to know for sure.
That was the last boat built there.
Yes, that was the last. They built the Bonington at Nakusp, and then they built the Nasukan here, and they built the Sycamoose in Penticton. The CPR was going to have a big tourist organization through this part of the country, and they built this hotel at Proctor, at the Outlet Hotel there at Proctor, their big tourist hotel, and they had quite elaborate plans. And then the war came along in 14 before they could it was in 13 I think the Penticton one was launched. And then the war came along. Well, of course, that stopped all operations, and then plans had changed, though everything had changed when the war was over, and they didn't go ahead with that. But the Bonington was quite an elaborate boat. It was a beautiful boat. And the crowds used to travel up and down on that boat.
Some of the places north of there, do you remember the St. Leon Hot Springs?
Yeah, St. Leon, a man named Grady ran that.
Do you remember him at all?
Yes, he was we thatch of white hair, and he was getting on even then, because he was a pretty old timer down there, and he didn't really. He hadn't really operated the place for quite a while as a hotel. It had been, but it was around that time, around the first war, that I think when he stopped operating it as a hotel. The Halcyon Hot Springs, of course, it operated right through the war. In fact, it operated more as a resort until General Burnham took it over, and then, of course, he turned it into a sanitarium. But I know, as a kid, my folks used to. Well, they come down, it wasn't a regular thing, but once in a while they'd run the old steamer Revelstoke down from Revelstoke with an excursion filled with Revelstoke people. They'd come down to Halcyon for a weekend party, like. And I know my folks used to come on those trips down the Columbia River and down through to Halcyon and then back up to Revelstoke. And it was quite a resort place.
Do you remember any of the places south of Nakusp there, like Burton? Did you ever go
Well,
there?
yeah, Burton was a... Well, yeah, they used to have a big, it was big for Burton, 24th of May celebration. Every year down there we had a special boat, and we used to go down there and they had a pretty good ball team. A fellow named McCormick, who had been quite a good ball player in his younger days, was sort of the backer and the trainer and manager. And he was a CPR engineer before he went down there and went farming. Out in Nakusp, he used to run the train. The trains used to run. There used to be a lot of trains in Nakusp in those days. That's before the Kettle Valley was built, you see, and all the coast freight used to come down the Arrow Lakes on barges to Nakusp, and then by train to Roseberry, and then by barge to Slocan City and into Nelson and down through the Crow. It all came that way. And he was an engineer. Then he quit and went down to Burton City and took up farming down there. Well, the Mineral City was through when we were out there. There wasn't anything. Mineral City was back of Burton, back in the mountains, and it was finished then. And of course, it never did amount to a great deal.
The orchards were beginning to grow around there.
Oh yes, they were shipping fruit from Burton. The boats used to pick up fruit all along there. There were quite nice farms along Burton, Graham's Landing, Mackinson's, DeMars, and all through there.
Are there any characters around there? Now, do you remember Lance Porter when he was on? Did you ever remember?
Lance Porter? No, I don't remember him. No, old Nels DeMars was he was quite an old character. In fact, he was mixed up with the locating of the Silver King mine here. As he was with the group that located it, and he's supposed to have found some of this float the day before, and it was getting on, so he didn't bother to look and see where it came from, so he kept on. Well, then the Hall brothers discovered it. So he always used to say if he hadn't been so lazy, he'd have been a millionaire. But he had a farm down there around West of Mars. He was mixed up in this Rose. A fellow named Cole got murdered down there, and DeMars was one of the fellows that was with that group. Of course, that was before my time, but I remember the stories. And then there was a fellow named Redfern used to come up, and I think he was mixed up with, he had relatives in England, I think, and also in Detroit. But I don't know too much about his early history. He used to come to town and get pretty tight. He was a pretty old man. He had a white beard, and I know he used to when he got a pretty tight, and he'd grunt away for a while, and he'd say, "Strike a bloody light." But that was his common expression. It didn't mean a thing, but old Daddy Redfern used to come to town, and every once in a while he'd have to come to town, and he had quite a little money apparently, and he lived down around West of Mars there, and he used to come in. He was mixed up in that white horse they used to take up to the hot springs. It was a white pony, and they got him in the bar room one time there, and they painted on St. Patrick's Day, and they painted the thing green, this horse green, and they give it a bucket full of beer to drink and turned it loose up the street. They used to, the old Grand Hotel, they did that.
What was this horse for? Did you say?
Well, the Sutherlands just had the horse, and then they used to rent it out to. Well, they had it for themselves. It was just a pony, and then anybody wanted to go to the hot springs. Well, you could rent the horse for $1, you see, and they'd tie the load on for you, so it would stay on, and then you'd take the horse up yourself, and then all you had to do was unpack your load up there, and the horse would come home alone. And sometimes he might make 2 or 3 trips. Well, not 3, but he'd make 2 trips in a day. He has made 2 trips in a day. It was 9 miles up to the hot springs, you see. But ordinarily, one trip was all that he would make. By the time he got back, and he'd come back and go right to his house.
Any other anecdotes about Nakusp?
I trying to think of something there that, but I offhand
hold it for a second if you like. Wondering.
Yeah, this there was a printing outfit there from the early days that Tom Abriel had bought, and he'd picked it up, and it was there. And then a fellow named Bobby Barrett had come out from England, a little short fellow, and quite a nice fellow. He used to play violin. I played in an orchestra with him. And so he started a newspaper they called the Arrow Lakes Advocate. And he ran it, for about 2 years, I guess. And it used to be, he used to set it all by hand, of course, everything was hand set. And he had this old army press that he used to print it on. And he used to have to, Dave Bulger used to go and help him to get it out, because it was a kind of a 2-man operation. He had to have a big roller with the ink on a piece of plank, and he'd roll this roller over the ink on the plank and then roll it over the type, put the paper down on it with a backing, and then he'd roll a thing that looked like a ringer, a clothes wringer, and roll this thing through that, lift up the other side, pick the paper off, and put another piece of paper in, ink your type all over again, and slide it back. So you couldn't run through too many. But I used to go up and help him once in a while, and Dave Bulger used to be, he was in the shipyard right across the street, you see, so he used to go up there and give him a hand to get his paper out. Well, then Bobby finally enlisted in a group that was supposed to go to Mesopotamia, Royal Engineers. And when he came back, well, he went down to Vancouver, and he didn't start the paper again. Of course, the paper folded up when he left. And he went to Vancouver and worked for the province until he died. He got married in England.
Remember the paper in New Denver?
Oh, yes, the leaser. Yes, a fellow named Jim Greer ran the leaser, and he was an old-timer in the country. He used to work for Colonel Lowry around the country. Colonel Lowry had papers all over the country. He ran a paper in Nakusp in 1893 then. And there was one thing about the leaser. It was an old press, an old Washington press they call it. And Jim used to get this paper out. It was a pretty small paper. It wasn't very big. And a fellow met him on the street one day, and he says, "Say, Jim," he says, "I didn't get a paper this week." Jim says, "Anybody say you were going to get one?" "Well," he says, "I paid for a year's subscription. I was supposed to get one once a week." He says, "You paid for 52 copies, and that's what you're going to get. There's nobody says you're going to get one every week." But it used to come out, whenever he got around to getting one out, he'd get it out. He had quite a sense of humor. There was something they were going to do down around, the government was going to do around Evans Creek there on Slocan Lake. And Jim wasn't in favor of that at all. He'd been arguing against it, and it hadn't made any difference. They went ahead and did it anyhow. Well, of course, it wasn't successful. So Jim came out with an editorial that the government had, in spite of all the things that he'd said about it, the government had gone ahead and done this thing. But he says, like a lot of other ideas evolved in cement, it wouldn't work. That he was quite an old boy, old Jim Greer.
What about this Lowry, Colonel Lowry? Do you remember him?
Well, I've just seen him, that's all. I couldn't say too much. I've got all kinds of stories about him, but they're not first-hand stories. In fact, I've been collecting material for maybe to write up Colonel Lowry, because he was, well, I don't know, I think he was another Mark Twain if he'd have had the right opportunity, but he wasn't in the, just in the right place. He was quite a writer.
Would you like to tell us something about him, some of the things that you in other words, where he came from?
Well, he came from back east. He came back in Ontario is where he came back from.
What year about?
Oh, well, it would be about 1892. He came here, and he ran the Nakusp Ledge. Everything was mining, and of course he had great hopes for the country. And he ran the Caslow claim. He was out over to Caslow when it was booming. He ran the Caslow claim. And then the Caslow had a little slump. And of course he didn't stay around any place where there was a slump, so he came out with the last copy of the paper, and on the front page he had a tombstone. And he had a picture of a tombstone, and he says, "Here lies the Caslow claim. Had a short but merry life in Caslow," and wrote, and then at the bottom he said, "Letter R.I.P." And in this paper, all the ads that hadn't been paid for were upside down, printed upside down in the paper. And the ones that were paid for were the right way up. So he always called himself the editor and financier of all the papers. He ran one in New Denver. He went over to New Denver, ran the New Denver Ledge. Well, then Caslow picked up again, so he came back and he started another paper called Caslow Reclaimed. And he sold out later on to a fellow named King from the States who started the Kootenayan. Well, then he ran in New Denver again. He ran another paper there, and he put out the Float, which were stories about various people around. And that he finished up in Greenwood, running the Greenwood Ledge, and that's where he died. But his writings are the things that he wrote about. He could write, a beautiful language, poetical language, and then he could get just as plain. And he used to write about preachers. That's what made some of these fellows a little peeved, because he didn't care what he said about a preacher. If a preacher did something that wasn't the way he thought it was, that didn't make any difference to him. He would write it up anyway. And of course, some of them didn't like that. But I've been trying to collect a lot of his writings and that. He McDougall in Nakusp there, that ran the hotel, was nominated for provincial legislature. So apparently he didn't think too much of McDougall, I guess. But anyway, he had an editorial in his paper how Mr. McDougall seems to have the idea that the people of this district want him to go down and do their business for them in Victoria. And he seems to have the idea that he's the only one that can do this. So I would suggest that we just let him dream on in peace. That sort of thing. They didn't care what they said. He had one paper in Caslow, there was a fellow arrested for supposed to have attacked a woman in her house. And he didn't believe the fellow would ever do such a thing. Knowing the man, he just says that he just couldn't do that. The man was drunk, and he'd gone to the house maybe. He'd had a few drinks, and he'd gone to this house looking for information. But outside of that, that was it. And this woman, of course, said that he had come to the house, you see, and tried to get in. Well, of course, he came out in the paper, he couldn't do that. Well, the trial was held in Caslow, and the fellow was found guilty and sentenced to Ocala jail. So he came out in his paper then, Laurie came out in his paper that with a write-up on the trial, and he said the man was found guilty, which is the greatest miscarriage of justice, he says, there's ever been in this country. Everybody knows the judge was drunk. They didn't care what they said, in those days in the papers.
Couldn't get away with that now.
No, that's good. They couldn't do it. I don't know whether you had any. My dad had a museum in Nakusp there that was quite an attraction while he lived, and he had all kinds of material from all over, and the teachers used to bring their kids up there. He had his house, and of course he'd close up his business any time of the day. He'd take somebody up there and show them around.